I met Paul and said, do you want to join my band, you know? And then George joined. And then Ringo joined. We were just a band who made it very, very big, that's all.
Hello there, my name's Scott, and welcome to Dig a Podcast, a show in which I give you an in-depth story behind the songs sung by the best band there is, was, and ever will be, the Beatles. In this season, Season 2, we work our way through the album Meet the Beatles, or our UK listeners know it as With the Beatles. Meet the Beatles is the second Beatles album released in the United States. It was the first US Beatles album to be issued by Capitol Records on 20th January 1964 in both mono and stereo formats. It topped the popular album chart on the 15th of February 1964 and remained at number 1 for 11 weeks before being replaced by the Beatles' second album. The cover featured Robert Freeman's iconic portrait of the Beatles used in the UK for the With the Beatles, with a blue tint added to the original stark black and white photograph. Let's carry on our journey with the 7th track of the Meet the Beatles LP.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Don't Bother Me. Professional songwriting is a true craft. Anyone who has ever written a hit song will guard with his or her life their early attempts at songwriting from being exposed to the world, out of sheer embarrassment, no doubt. In almost all cases, many years of trial and error precede any success that a songwriter will achieve in his lifetime. There are, of course, exceptions to any rule. George Harrison is a definitive exception to this rule, buoyed on by the success and financial advantages of Lennon and McCartney being hit-making songwriters for the Beatles, as well as other artists. George saw a potential opportunity for himself. His self-proclaimed main focus within the group was to be the best lead guitarist that he could be, especially with the enormous British success the Beatles were enjoying by mid-1963. But now his focus suddenly began to shift to songwriting. In order for George to have lead vocals to sing on their albums, he was at first relegated to singing cover songs such as Chains or Lennon McCartney's originals such as Do You Want to Know a Secret? All of that changed forever on August of 1963. McCartney relates, a lot of the girls were mad on him, so he always wanted to give him at least one track. Then George started to catch on, saying, why should you write my songs? And then he started writing his own. What is truly unique about this situation is that the Beatles were huge British stars by the time George Harrison decided to give songwriting a try. Indeed, they were on the brink of being properly introduced to the American market as well. I used to have a hang-up about telling John, Paul and Ringo I had a song for the album, George admitted in 1969, because I felt mentally, at the time, as if I was trying to compete. And in a way, the standing of the songs had to be good, because John and Paul's were very good. I don't want the Beatles to be recording rubbish for my sake, just because I wrote it. Instead of dismissing his very first attempt at writing a song, he confidently inserted himself in introducing that song as a contender for their second album, which was then in the process of being recorded. As history shows, George Harrison's first solo composition, Don't Bother Me, appeared on the multi-million selling British album With the Beatles, as well as the highly successful and influential American album Meet the Beatles, which sold over 5 million copies. His confidence, as it turned out, was not unfounded. The song fit in very nicely on both the albums, and, by extension, earned an appearance in the Beatles' award-winning, highly acclaimed first movie, A Hard Day's Night. Quite an impressive feat for an amateur songwriter. Songwriting history. I wrote the song as an exercise to see if I could write a song, said Harrison. I was sick in bed. Maybe that's why it turned out to be Don't Bother Me. The bed that George was sick in was at the Palace Court Hotel in Bournemouth, where the Beatles were playing 6 nights at the Gaumont Cinema in August of 1963. Evidence suggests August 19th is the unofficial date the songwriting began. Their stay there on this week, incidentally, was the time that photographer Robert Freeman took the famous cover photograph of the group that graced the cover of both the British With the Beatles album and the American Meet the Beatles album. George elaborates a little further in Hunter Davis' biography, The Beatles. I was a bit run down and was supposed to be having some sort of tonic, taking it easy for a few days. I decided to try to write a song, just for a laugh. I got out my guitar and I played around until the song came. I forgot all about it till we came to record the next LP. It was a fairly crappy song. I forgot about it completely once it was on the album. As for inspiration, an unconfirmed experience sheds a little light on the subject for Don't Bother Me. Bill Harry, longtime friend of the Beatles and founder of the Liverpool music paper Merseybeat, used to pester George reportedly to become a songwriter like his bandmates were. He would ask George if he had written one yet whenever he would run into him. Harry relates, when George was about to go out one night, he thought he might bump into me. So he started writing a number which he called Don't Bother Me. While this may or not be just about an amusing anecdote, what is confirmed is that George wrote this dourly resentful song because he felt low and wanted to be left alone. This self-admitted exercise of writing a song did have a lucrative outcome in the long run. Not only did the song itself provide Harrison with a taste of the financial success that Lennon and McCartney were enjoying, but extended much further. At least it showed me that all I needed to do was to keep on writing, and maybe eventually I would write something good. George related. It did, however, provide me with an occupation. This occupation broadened his outlook as well as his role within the Beatles. Not only was their lead guitarist, but now he was a contributing songwriter. His role as songwriter would continue to grow in quantity as well as quality throughout the Beatles' career, throughout his solo years, and for the rest of his life. His introduction to songwriting was very much learned from his bandmates. I knew a little bit about writing from my others, from the privileged point of sitting in the car when a song was written or coming into being. Collaborating was not of interest of George, however, as he continues. Writing on my own became the only way I could do it, because it started like that. Consequently, over the years, I never really wrote with anyone else, and I became a bit isolated. I suppose I was a bit paranoid, because I didn't have any experience of what it was like, writing with other people. It's a tricky thing. What's acceptable to one person may not be acceptable to another. Recording history. Between August 19th and 24th, home recordings were made by George Harrison during his composing and constructing of the song. These were used to ready himself, as well as, no doubt, to be played to the rest of the band to facilitate learning the song in preparation for their actual recording session in the studio. September 11th, 1963 was the first Beatles recording session to feature a George Harrison composition. It was the last of 5 songs attempted on this day, which was the third recording session for their second British album. Recording of this song began during the evening session, which ran from 7 until 10:15 p.m. The Lennon penned Not a Second Time was begun and completed during this session, which puts the start of Don't Bother Me at approximately 9 p.m. 4 full band performances were recorded on this day. John Lennon, being in an experimental mood, tried out a new gadget as they had purchased a few months earlier at Salmer's Music Store in London, this being a Gibson Maestro fuzz tone. George had attempted to use this early distortion effect during the session for She Loves You back on July 1st of that year, but they decided not to use it on the final recording. Lennon was eager to get some use out of it on the day and tried it out on the early attempts of the rhythm track. According to the September 28, 1963 issue of Melody Maker magazine, a journalist was present in the studio on this day. When they had rearranged the opening bars, he related, John produced a fuzz box. John was knocked out by the results. But George Martin wasn't too happy. You'll have to do something, John, said Martin. It's already distorted from the amplifier. Do you think it sounds okay? Are you sure about it? Apparently, the use of this device was shelved for the day. The effect would not be used until George's Think for Yourself was recorded 2 years later. Still wanted to try something new, George Harrison asked engineer Norman Smith, "Can we have a compressor on this guitar? We might try to get a sort of organ sound." What they come up with was the use of the amplifier tremolo on John's guitar, which displayed a rhythmic fluctuation of volume. As stated in Andy Babiak's book, Beatles Gear, this was the group's first evident use in the studio of an electronic effect on a guitar sound, and thus marked the start of his search for unusual sounds and heralded the group's role as studio experimenters in coming years. 3 overdubs, most likely lead vocals, were recorded on top of, presumably, the 4th take. The four of us determined that this rendition of the song was not satisfactory. The song had more of a straightforward beat at this stage, and had not been thoroughly rehearsed by the group. A new song structure was called for, so the song was temporarily shelved. The next day, September 12, 1963, the Beatles resumed work on the song in EMI Studio 2, once again during that day's evening session. The longer than usual session, from 7 to 11:30 p.m, started out with a brand new attempt at the song. Starting from scratch at a round number of take 10, this attempt included all the basic elements of the song, including lead vocals and the guitar solo. While this was somewhat slower than the finished product as we know it, it was a near-perfect rendition. The only flaws were George's occasional off-key vocal and Ringo's accent flub at the very end, which prompted George to sarcastically sing "Oh yeah, rock and roll now," as an indication that this take couldn't be used. The group then decided to incorporate a Beatles break just before George begins singing the first verse. With this in mind, take 11 broke down just into the first verse. Take 12 got a little further, although Ringo kept putting the breaks in the wrong places, resulting in George stopping the song saying "no, no, no." However, take 13, which then admitted that first break, was deemed the best. Notice though that Ringo does mistakenly perform a break just before the first bridge during the words "I know I'll." Starting from take 14, an extensive overdub was being attempted, which compromised George double-tracking his lead vocal, Paul playing claves, John playing tambourine, and George playing an Arabian bongo, all of which they found when they raided the EMI closet. The second attempt of the overdubs, take 15, was considered the best in the end, although they continued overdubbing through take 19, although none of these takes were used. The song was deemed complete by approximately 8:30 p.m. The monomix was made from what was now considered take 15 on September 30th, 1963, with only George Martin and engineers Norman Smith and young Jeff Emmerich in attendance. The stereo mix was hurriedly made on October 29th, 1963 by the same EMI staff, being joined by the mysterious engineer with the initials BT. The stereo mix comprises all of the instruments panned primarily to the left channel, and both of George's lead vocal tracks panned primarily to the right. Curiously, a rare stereo mix of Don't Bother Me has surfaced on Canadian pressings of Meet the Beatles from 1976. This purple label Capitol album features an added word from George during the final verse. When she's coming home, until that day, don't come around. Speculation has it that either a second stereo mix of the song was made back on October 29th, 1963 that didn't splice out his vocal flub from George, or that this otherwise identical stereo mix was touched up before it went to press upon its original release. Canada had never received a stereo mix of this song prior to this time, so an undoctored stereo mix may have been sent out to them from EMI, especially for this release. In any case, this anomaly is quite interesting for Beatles enthusiasts. Thanks for listening to Dig a Podcast. You can subscribe to our podcast on Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. This has been a Team Wilco production. Until next time, if you know what I mean. Do I did? No? Okay.